Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. On this week's episode, Agri-economist Trevor Donnellan joins us to discuss the factors driving increased production costs on Irish dairy farms and how the buoyant milk price is somewhat working to offset these costs. And Trevor started by documenting the global fertiliser, feed and energy trends.
It's hard to understate really how much is happening or has been happening of late. We've seen some very dramatic price movements in respect of input prices that are the price of inputs used in agriculture, and also we're starting to see, or we've begun to see increases in the price of outputs, what farmers actually sell. But that's happening at a bit of a lag. But essentially all of this can be traced back, or the origins of it in terms of when it began to start, can go all the way back to last summer really, when we began to see an increase in gas prices in Europe, natural gas prices. And that was down to the fact that the normal increase in the amount of gas coming into Europe over the summer period when demand is less wasn't happening. And there began to be a little bit of panic in the market in terms of securing gas supplies for various different uses. So gas prices took off as a result of that. And one of the first sectors that really was affected by that is the fertiliser industry, because it became very expensive to buy natural gas and very expensive to produce nitrogen-based fertiliser. And some of these businesses began to become concerned that they would be producing fertiliser at very high cost and might actually not be able to sell that fertiliser on in due course if the price of gas was to fall again subsequently. So what happened was you began to see some of the fertiliser plants going offline and ceasing production. And then a bit of a scramble started to begin, I guess, in terms of getting access to fertiliser and concern about the very high price level towards the end of last year and whether it would persist into the current year. I guess there wasn't that much concern amongst grassland producers or grassland farmers last year because the price was increasing at a time when there mightn't be that much fertiliser being used. So when we got into this year, it became clear that we're in a very high priced environment for fertiliser. The war in Ukraine, I guess, kicked things off even further, because that led to a big increase in oil prices, number one. And that when oil prices go up, that has huge inflationary impacts across the entire economy, because oil is used for transport, for example, and it's used in the production processes for various items as well. So that kicks through quite a lot into the general economy. And what we also saw was the increase in feed prices arising out of the fact that Ukraine and Russia are significant grain producers, number one, but particularly they're significant grain exporters. And it's the volume of product that's available for export markets that sets the price for grain and oilseeds internationally. And they're both significant enough producers and exporters of grains and oilseeds to have an effect on the market. So we saw prices starting to move upwards quite significantly on the feed side as well. So between feed, fertiliser and fuel, we had some fairly significant increases taking place in a very short period of time.
And let's bring that, Trevor, to the context of Irish dairy and look at those inputs in particular. So feed, from a feed perspective, how self-sufficient or I suppose insufficient are we in Ireland in terms of the amount of grain we produce relative to the amount of grain we need for agricultural production?
Yeah, I mean, when we look at this, broadly speaking, we have three main requirements in terms of feed for cattle, feed for pigs, and feed for poultry, and there's a small amount of feed as well required for sheep, but it's not that significant. But looking at those three sectors, we don't actually produce enough feed in Ireland to cover the demand for cattle, pigs, poultry and sheep. And as a result of that, we have to import some of our feed. So we're importing things like maize and soybeans, which don't really go very well in this country. So protein type crops, we're importing those. And I'm not sure that we'll ever be, self-sufficient in terms of feed requirements for things like that because of where we are in the world. But what we're also importing as well, it's important to understand, are kind of byproducts of the food production process, things that we wouldn't eat as humans, but which are perfectly acceptable as feed for animals. So these would be kind of residues from the production of things like oils, for example. So when you crush oil seeds, what you can get is oil meals. So that's an example of something that we would otherwise have to dispose of, essentially, if we couldn't feed it to animals. So some of what we're importing is actually residues of the food production system, which are, an example, you could say, of the circular economy. We'll say where we're reusing something and turning it from what is effectively a waste product from a human food point of view into something that we could actually consume at the end of the day, whether it be through meat or through milk. But yeah, we have a significant enough import requirement, but it should be kept in mind as well that cattle in Ireland don't consume very much feed. Most of their diet at the end of the day is coming from grass and silage, and your average dairy cow in Ireland only consumes about a tonne of grain in the year, which is quite a small amount by comparison with what you'd see happening in other parts of Europe, for example.
And a further question on feed, what is the relative price of feed today compared with 2021?
Yeah, I mean, we expect feed prices this year to be about 20% higher than what they were in 2021. And, feed prices have been moving upwards now for a number of years. So, there's an upward trend. There was an upward trend in feed prices anyway, and we expected feed prices to increase in 2022, even if the war in Ukraine hadn't occurred. But I guess what has happened there now is that it has created that additional shortage of grain on the international market, that it's pushing the price up further. So at the moment, we expect those prices to be up by the territory of around 20% in terms of feed prices, and that farmers will average out over the course of this year compared to the average for last year.
And then to fertiliser, I mean, you have painted the picture of, I suppose, the growing nature of the cost of fertiliser with the backdrop of the, I suppose, lack of supply from actually the middle of last year. I suppose, as you say, it wasn't necessarily a concern last year, but it grew in January, February. And I suppose the concern was the cost, the price to pay, but also supply. I mean, where are supplies at now? There was conversation about potentially not having fertiliser for the second half of the year. Is this a reality that we're going to see?
Yeah, I think the situation isn't quite as bad, my understanding at least anyway, it isn't quite as bad as we thought it could get in terms of availability. The price itself is an issue, but from the perspective of availability, there is a significant volume of fertiliser now in the country. I think some of the difficulty is around getting that fertiliser out and onto farms. Ultimately, there's a kind of a bit of a bottleneck, I guess, in the system in terms of you can't just land fertilizer into the country and transport it directly to a farm. That's not the way the distribution process actually works. So there are some delays in getting fertiliser out to people, and there mightn't be the range of fertilisers available when farmers go to look to buy specific fertilisers that there might normally be. But we're not really in the situation where you could say that there's a shortage of fertiliser out there. I think because of the high price level, anyway, some farmers will be more cautious about the amount of fertiliser they will use in the current year.
Trevor, from your experience, is that the right approach, to pull back on the amount of fertiliser you spread based on the price? Or is it just a fact of the systems a lot of us have on farm? We've perennial ryegrass swards, there is a demand for nitrogen.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess the situation here for dairy farmers is somewhat different to what you might be facing if you were a dry stock farmer. At the end of the day, at the moment, the price of milk is very high. So cutting back on fertilizer use to the point where it's going to have, say, an impact on yield and what have you, might ultimately be counterproductive, because your savings on costs might also materialize in a lower than anticipated milk check coming out of the other side of it. I think much of it as well will depend on the weather conditions, whether as we go through the peak part of the season, a favourable set of circumstances from a weather point of view will mean that if you are using a little bit less fertiliser, things mightn't be quite as tricky. And then you can have an alternative outcome as well, I guess, where weather conditions really aren't that favourable at all, and where cutting back on fertiliser use could end up being more problematic in the context of grass availability and the production of silage. So I think it's a difficult one to make any kind of general statement on at this point in the year. But I suppose the main point that we'd make is that it's dairy farmers are, I suppose, fortunate to be in a somewhat better position than dry stock farmers in looking at decisions like that because of the high milk price.
We would have spoken with Patrick Going, in terms of forecasted cash flows he had done, and feed and fertiliser were ones that were flagged. But I guess energy in the form of electricity and diesel is now something, again, that we're talking about. Where are prices at there, Trevor? And, how is that going to impact on us this year?
Yeah, well, I mean, the price level, it's kind of well reported that the price level for farm diesel has increased dramatically. It's hard to be sure what the overall increase will be in the price for this year as a whole compared to last year. A lot will depend on how the oil market, crude oil market, evolves over the next while. That's heavily linked into how the situation in Ukraine develops, but increases of 60% in terms of farm diesel prices wouldn't surprise me over the course of this year. It's hard to be sure, but that kind of a percentage increase, if you compare what farmers might pay on average, we'll say in 2022 compared to what they might have been paying on average in 2021. And again, electricity isn't as important or isn't as large a cost component. It's not insignificant either on dairy farms, given that you have a requirement for electricity for milking and refrigerating the milk before it's collected and what have you. So that will be an issue as well. Quite how much of an increase we see in electricity prices over the course of the year, again, that's a bit trickier to call, because electricity is a mix of different energy sources, and there are other costs in the chain as well when you're producing electricity. But an increase there of the order of 30% over the course of this year compared to what was paid last year wouldn't surprise me either.
And you mentioned the high milk price, and you would have to say that the dairy industry in Ireland is fairly buoyant at the moment, and milk price is on the rise. What are the factors that are supporting such a high milk price being received by farmers?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, we need to kind of maybe split this in two, because before the invasion of Ukraine occurred, things were already looking quite positive in dairy markets. We saw quite a large increase in dairy product prices towards the end of last year. In the final quarter in particular, prices increased quite significantly and more than many people had expected. And the expectation was that we'd have high prices in the early part of this year, and then that prices would begin to fall back as the year progressed. Now the war in Ukraine changed that 2022 outlook, and in fact, if anything, what we've seen in 2022 is prices continuing to increase, and the expectation for the current year really is that prices will remain high right through the part of the year that we're interested in anyway, in terms of the grass-based production system. So well into the third quarter of this year, it seems like we are destined to have fairly high prices. And the reasons behind that are, there's a few, I suppose. The southern hemisphere production year wasn't fantastic, though the year that has come to an end now. That wasn't fantastic in terms of the increase recorded in the southern hemisphere. There are logistical issues as well in terms of increasing milk production in the US. There's a lot of problems in terms of processing capacity and labour just on farms, and even in transporting milk around. So the US situation is looking kind of difficult enough as well. On the demand side, the situation in China continued to look very positive in terms of imports coming in there. But people were uncertain as to whether that would continue, whether that was kind of actually product that was being used or product that was going into China to kind of build up stocks. That part wasn't very clear from the perspective of people looking at the demand side of the market. And you have a situation now, I guess, where even though we have very high milk prices, we also have a considerable increase in production costs. So that could be a limiting factor as well. So the total increase we might see in milk production globally this year could be very small. Some people are even suggesting there won't be an increase in milk production globally this year. And one of the things, I suppose, from an Irish perspective is we tend to do better than other countries in Europe when there's a shortage of milk out there. Our exposure to international markets actually benefits us to a greater extent than, we'll say, countries where most of the milk is being, in Europe, is being produced and consumed on the home market. We're very different in that regard. So, we're seeing very high prices for butter now, for example, at the moment. And because butter is a significant component of our dairy product mix, that is, benefiting the milk price we're getting here in Ireland. So we're quite far up the milk price league in Europe at the moment. We're up near the top now in terms of milk prices being paid in Ireland, which is something that you kind of tend to see happening in periods where international dairy product prices are very high.
And you mentioned, say, dairy product pricing, so the products we're exporting, are high at the moment. Is that across the board, Trevor, or are there particular dairy products that are contributing to that higher price?
It is, broadly speaking, it's across the board. I suppose the one exception really is in respect of cheese. I mean, cheese prices are more determined by what's happening on the European market, really, and while those prices have increased as well, they haven't increased to the same extent. The cheese price generally isn't as volatile as, we'll say, the price for butter, for powders, or for whey. So yeah, I mean the price of powders, whey, butter, they've all increased quite strongly now. Since the back end of last year and into this year, that strength in the market is being maintained, and that's essentially what's allowing milk processors pay the high milk prices we're seeing at present.
Taking into account all the information you have given us today, there is significant increases in cost on farms. There is a backdrop that there is a really high milk price that is supporting that. So if we look to overall profitability in 2022, what sort of a state do you see dairy farms in at the end of the year?
Yeah, I when I started looking at this, I started and looking at the calculations. I was scratching my head and wondering whether the increase in costs could be made up by the increase in milk price. And certainly in terms of the developments in the last couple of months in terms of dairy markets, it looks increasingly likely that the increase in production costs, even though it is spectacularly large, can be offset by the increase in milk prices. Like we're looking at, in terms of the most recent estimates we've put out here last week, an increase in total production costs, and that's not just the direct cost of production; it also includes the overhead costs. So we're looking at an increase this year of about 30%, which is in the territory of 8 cents a litre. But we could see that size of an increase in terms of the milk price transpiring as well this year in comparison with last year. So that would be enough basically to maintain margins if that was to come about. There are some specific sets of circumstances, all right, where dairy farmers may yet come out on the wrong side of things, and that's an issue for farmers who have maybe a significant amount of milk in a fixed price contract, which is set at a level that's a good bit below what the market is actually paying at present. And some processors, I think, have made moves to try to address that anomaly to some extent. It's ironic, I suppose, that people having milk in a fixed price contract would be coming out on the wrong side of things to the extent that they are, because there's never been a set of circumstances since these fixed milk price contracts came into place where the price available on the market is so different to what's actually available through the fixed price contract. So I think some farmers will be feeling quite sore about that aspect when they come to look at the bottom line for 2022 in this time next year, we'll say. So yeah, I think there's a reasonable enough prospect that income levels in 2022 could be on a par with 2021 on some farms, and there's even a set of circumstances potentially where incomes on dairy farms this year could actually even be higher than they were last year. There's a lot to play out yet. We're only in the month of April. We've the bulk of the production season ahead of us yet, and we don't know what weather is going to throw at us, and that can have a little bit of an effect as well. But in terms of what we know so far for the year, it's looking like a reasonable year for dairy farming. Dairy farmers will escape this kind of cost pressure situation because of the high milk price. But we'll be coming back and looking at this again in 2 or 3 months' time, and when we have more information and we'll have a better sense, I think, at that point, what the incomes for the year will look like.
And as you say, Trevor, there's a huge amount of factors at play that are out of our control. But this has been a really enlightening conversation, and it has given me, I suppose, huge positivity, as you say, heading in that there's a long way to go in the season yet. And you've highlighted some of the strengths of dairy businesses in Ireland. It's grass-based, which is the cheapest feed available, with a lower reliance on a supplement that we're potentially importing from abroad, and also that we have that high milk price, and on a lot of farms there's very high fat and protein constituents which are driving the milk price beyond base. So there's a good outlook ahead in terms of financial performance for dairy farms this year. Thank you, Trevor.
Thanks, Emma-Louise.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Trevor Donnellan for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.